Life is noisy. It's filled with voices pulling us in all sorts of different directions. Other people's opinions, our own thoughts, our doubts cloud our mind. We hear the whispers of God, but how do we know? How do we know that it's God's voice? In this video, I'm going to share 3 clear signs that God is speaking to you. I wonder, are you ready to listen? Hearing from God isn't reserved for a chosen few. It's not about being perfect or super spiritual. It's about being open. God is always speaking. I remember when I was a pastor working at one church, I brought this concern to my pastor. And I told him that this verse haunted me because I didn't know God's voice. I didn't recognize it. And we talked about it for a while, and there was some back and forth for a little while. And then at some point, he told me his experience. He said that when God spoke to him, the way that he knew that it was God speaking is that he would audibly hear the angels sing. It sounded weird to me, and it still does. I've never had that experience. It's hard for me to imagine having that experience. I don't want to belittle his experience and laugh it off and say that it's not possible, but I can tell you, after 20 plus years in ministry, that is still not my lived experience. That's not how I know that God is speaking to me. But I will tell you that I'm no longer haunted by this verse that says, "My sheep will know my voice." Gandhi said, if you don't find God in the next person that you meet, it's a waste of time to keep looking. One of the ways that we can hear from God is through other people. If you pay attention, if you can see God at work within them, we might begin to recognize that this person is an image bearer of God. The scriptures tell us that. That means that when you listen to a person, you have the potential of hearing God through them, hearing God in their voice. It's understandable that we may doubt clearly hearing the voice of God in other people. We do twist that image of God. But if you find yourself in doubt, if you find yourself struggling to see that, look to the marginalized. Look to the children. They bear that image in a special way. Jesus was telling a story about how at the end times people would come to him, and some would come and say they had done all kinds of work in his name, and he would say, "Go, I don't know you." And others, he would thank them and say, when I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. And when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. And when I was in prison, you visited me. And they would say, "Jesus, I don't remember any of that." And Jesus said, "When you did for the least of these, you did for me." Children are another example of this. Think about when the children came to Jesus and the disciples tried to keep the children away. Jesus said, "Let them come." And he pointed out how the kingdom of heaven was theirs. Those who need something to drink, who need something to eat, those in prison that need visiting, those in the hospitals that are sick, those who are marginalized, the immigrants, the people pushed to the side. These are people who bear the image of God. When I see the divine in another person, we notice people in a special way. We will hear God. The second way that we can listen for the voice of God is to listen to the desires of our heart. Scripture tells us that the desires were placed there by God. Again, we can twist those desires, but Ignatius of Loyola taught us to mine the depths of our heart, to mine the desires, and that even when we have twisted them, even when those desires have gone awry, that somewhere deep within the desire itself is something of the voice of God. The third way that we can hear the voice of God is in our tears. There's this old story about a rabbi who died, and he goes to heaven, and as he approaches the throne room, he approaches boldly, and he goes up to God, and he confronts God on the great suffering in the world. And he says, "God, we were crying. I was crying, and we were mourning, and we were moaning and wailing at the suffering and the awful situation that the world is in. Where were you?" And the story says that God responded back, I was in your tears. I was in your mourning and I was in your wailing. I was in that place. The story is a reminder that not only has God experienced in the life of Christ the suffering and pain, but that the suffering, the pain, the mourning, the wailing, the tears, those moments in our life when we suffer, the part of us that yearns for something more, that expects something more, is the voice of God. And that if we listen to that voice, if we listen to our tears, we can hear the voice of God. None of these ways are quite like that pastor that told me he could hear the angels sing, but for me, I find them more clear. I would doubt if I heard the angels sing. I would worry that that was my own imagination or that I wanted to hear it. But when I hear the voice of God in another human being, when I look within the desires of my own heart and I notice that a desire was placed there by God, when I can see and hear the voice of God in my own tears and in my suffering, I know that God has spoken. And so I hope that these are ways that you can potentially press in and hear and feel comfortable learning and hearing the voice of God, so that when you read that scripture, my sheep will know my voice, that you know the voice of Christ. I want you to take a moment, reflect. How has God been speaking to you in the people that you've met, in the people that you rub shoulders with day in and day out? As you pay attention to them, as you notice them, how is God speaking to you? What desires do you notice within you that God has placed there that tell you something about the God that you serve? What tears have you shed that are a reminder of what the world should be, that say something about who God is? I want you to comment below and tell us, what are you noticing? And if you want to have a more in-depth conversation, I want to invite you to the Spiritual Wondering Community, a group of like-minded people who are thinking about spirituality in unique ways. The information on joining is in the description below. Join the community. It's completely free. And let's start a conversation about how God is speaking to you.